Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Walker, and I'm with the Lone Star chapter of the Sierra Club. Thank you for joining us all this afternoon for the webinar, Keeping Rivers Flowing, Innovative Strategies to Protect and Restore Rivers. This is the first of a three-part series where we explore what actions being taken to protect and restore rivers around the world, in the U.S. and here in Texas. We hope to bring the best of what is happening back to Texas and explore whether these applications make sense for our state. We have three knowledgeable presenters today. First is Andy Samson with the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment. He will discuss why this is an important topic for Texas and describe what is at stake if we don't address these issues. Andy will be followed by Brian Richter from the Nature Conservancy. Brian has studied river systems around the world for many years and has examined how they are managed and operated, as well as the cultural and environmental impacts of management decisions. He will bring us an international perspective on the state of rivers and what is being done to protect and restore them. Myron Hess with the National Wildlife Federation will bring us back to Texas and discuss opportunities and approaches that we might consider in our home state. Just a few logistics. The webinar will be 60 minutes in length. We have included time for questions and answers at the end of all the presentations. After all the presentations are done, we will have time for questions and answers. Please type any questions you have in the control panel on the right side of your screen as we proceed. We will select several questions to hand off to Andy, Brian, and Myron for the question and answer period, and we will attempt to answer others as we proceed. We will have a few polling questions as we proceed through the webinar. Keep an eye out for those and be ready to give your input. Thank you for attending the webinar today. Let's go ahead and get started with our first presenter, Andy Samson.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for including me today, for organizing this webinar and for allowing me to participate with Brian and Myron, both of whom know far more about this issue than I do. First of all, I think we should understand that although we've had a really serious drought here in Texas for the last several years, this is a global issue. Across the world, the average woman walks 9 miles a day to get water for her family. This means that she is not able to spend time doing other things like earning money, taking care of her children, or all of the other things that help support both economic success and quality of life for these families. Every 20 seconds across the world, a child dies because of lack of water or poor water quality, which means that in the time that we're going to be together this afternoon, there'll probably be 50 or 60 people across the world who pass away due to waterborne issues, and most of them will be children. Here in Texas, the principal issue for us is the population of our state is expected to grow by 100%. We're going to have twice as many people in the next 50 years as we have today, and yet we have already given permission for more water to be withdrawn from most of our rivers than is actually in them, such that if all the water rights permits that were granted in Texas today were actually exercised, many of our rivers would be completely dry. So what can we do about that? Well, as all of us know, our legislature has provided for a significant revolving fund of over $2 billion to be expended in the coming years on water infrastructure. I guess the thing that I would say about that that's most significant to me is that 20% of those funds will be dedicated to water conservation and 10% to rural projects. So the sponsors of this legislation were sensitive to the fact that water conservation is a significant part of the package going forward. But I think if I had any particular message to leave with the listeners today, it would be that we can't simply believe that we're going to throw a couple of $1 billion in this and solve the problem. We can't build our way out of it. First of all, Texas, all of our watersheds and all of our recharge areas and all of the things that make the hydrologic system work are on private land in Texas. And Texas loses more land from rural and agricultural use each year than any other state. Between 1997 and 2007 alone, we lost 2 million acres of farms, ranches, and forest land to other uses. The biggest terrestrial environmental issue that we face, and it's directly related to our water problems, is the continued fragmentation of family land in Texas. We continue to waste too much water in Texas. We need to understand that the easiest and the cheapest water for us to get is the water that we already have. The cities of San Antonio and El Paso have lowered their consumption of water by 40% per capita and still continue to prosper economically. San Antonio has grown by over 1.5 million citizens in the last 15 or 20 years, and yet its overall water consumption has been flat. For me, one of the most significant issues, and the one that brings us all together today, is environmental flows. We have been completely inadequate here in Texas in our attempts to make sure that after all of the other things that we use water for, our industrial use, our municipal use in agriculture, that we maintain in our rivers and streams sufficient water to protect the ecosystems. We are currently experiencing probably one of the most landmark cases we're going to face in this issue, which has to do with the inflows into San Antonio Bay to support the whooping crane. But we must remember that every river basin in Texas where endangered species are or may be present in the future, we have the potential of fighting the federal government over the management of our surface water because of our inability to adhere to the Endangered Species Act. The most daunting one for us is that we simply have been unable to sufficiently connect our management of surface water and groundwater. We treat groundwater in Texas as if it were the private property of the individuals who own the land above it, and yet the surface water in our rivers and streams has historically, since we've been a colony of Spain, belonged to the state. And so basically we're in a position now where the state has told two different types of individuals that the same water belongs to them, and that's completely unsustainable in my judgment going forward. So I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this webinar and look forward to the presentations and questions to come.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. And Andy, it's an honor to be in the same place with you anywhere. So appreciate the opportunity here to join the panel and to be with all of you today. I'm joining you all from Pensacola, Florida, where last night we received 12 inches of rain in about 12 hours. No, I got that wrong. 21 inches of rain in 12 hours. So they're definitely keeping the rivers flowing here in this part of Florida. Not the same, of course, in other places, including in Texas. Jennifer, I'm not sure that I've got control right now. It's not showing up. There we go. Okay. All right. So I thought I'd start with just sort of a very broad-brushed overview of, from a scientific perspective, here are some of the considerations that scientists keep in mind when they're asked the question of whether or not a particular river or other freshwater ecosystem is in a healthy condition. And this thinking really emerged from a scientist by the name of James Carr, who was at the University of Washington in the Pacific Northwest. Jim published a couple of papers back in the 1980s where he highlighted these 5 factors as being of paramount influence on the health, on the ecological health of a river ecosystem. And so physical habitat, of course, having a diversity of structures that are available within the stream environment, riffles, rapids, pools, things like that. Those are all expressions of physical habitat, and the physical habitat leads to a greater diversity in the plants and animals that can live in a given river system. The species that are within the system matter a great deal, and in fact shape other elements of the ecosystem. So, for instance, when you have a highly invasive species being introduced into a river system, it can have very large consequences for the other species that live there, and it can affect other parts of the ecosystems. Like it may cause the water quality to be influenced, or it may influence the aquatic vegetation that will exist there, depending upon what their feeding patterns and habits are. It's also important to think about what we call connectivity, meaning is water, sediment, animals able to move both upstream and downstream within the river system, as well as is the water able to get out of the main channel and spill out onto floodplain areas. Very important for the health of the vegetation out in the floodplain, and also for a lot of species that depend upon those flooding processes as maintaining their life cycles. And then water chemistry, or water quality as it's more commonly referred to, obviously. What is the chemical makeup of the water? That has a huge influence on the things that can grow there, and also on its acceptability for various human uses. And then lastly, the water flow regime, and that's the one, of course, that we're going to be focusing on mostly today. That has really been identified as being of paramount among these 5 other issues or other considerations within a river system. There are many scientists that have referred to this as the organizing variable, the master variable in the river ecosystem. An Australian scientist named Keith Walker has referred to it as the maestro of the aquatic orchestra. So really, really important, the water flow regime. I'm sorry for the delays here. We were testing this out, and it looks like we've got at least a couple of seconds in the delays in between slides, so I apologize for that. So within rivers and their water flow regimes, you do see similar patterns, similar general patterns appearing in essentially all rivers. So as illustrated in this diagram, you can identify times of the year or times during certain years where the water is low. There are occasions where you might get a little rainfall that will bring the river level up and cause a high flow or a high pulse, as it's often called. There are other times, of course, like here in Pensacola last night, where a tremendous amount of water comes in as rainfall or as snow melt and actually causes a natural flood in the system. And so those patterns, you could identify additional characteristics of patterns, but those are some of the general ones that you can see repeating in rivers all around the world, as illustrated by the diagrams on the right. So depending upon if most of the water that gets into the river is coming from rainstorms, those rainstorms might be very seasonal, such as during monsoon conditions in certain countries. The water flow may be very seasonal because of snow melting in the mountains, such as what happens for the Yampa River in Colorado after the snow melts in the Rocky Mountains. And then the size of river can also express a different kind of a water flow regime, as shown by the Mississippi, where you have so many smaller and medium-sized rivers coming together and coalescing into the Mississippi River. And so you see a very broad sort of a hydrograph signature typically in the larger rivers. Things don't bounce up and down nearly as erratically as they will in a smaller river system. The larger river systems really attenuate that signature. And so these signatures are really important. The aquatic scientists have really learned over the last few decades that all of these variations have influence on the plants and animals that live in these systems. And also, they also have a lot of influence on the availability of water for human purposes, of course. So depending upon when the timing of the water is coming as compared to when we need it for irrigation or for city water use or for industrial water use can matter a great deal. And so I just wanted to say that, some time ago, 15, 20 years ago, the scientific community really came together and said, and basically affirmed that point, that that natural expression of variability, of highs and lows and seasonality, and the frequency with which you experience flood events, how quickly the river will rise from a low condition to a high condition and vice versa, those all have potential consequences on the plants and animals that live in those systems. And so we need to keep in mind, and in fact we characterized this as the natural flow paradigm some time ago, just to acknowledge, just to affirm that essentially every aspect of that natural variability can be important to some or many of the species that live within a given river system. But of course, we're living in a world where most of the river systems on the planet have now been modified for human benefits, for human purposes. Farming, urban water use, industrial uses, generating electricity, that sort of thing. And so each of these factors can modify that natural variability to varying degrees. The building of a dam obviously stops the flow of water downstream, stores the water for some period, and then the water is released downstream as dictated by the needs of the reservoir operators to generate electricity, to provide irrigation water for users downstream, etc. Obviously, direct diversions out of a stream or pumping from shallow groundwater systems that are connected to surface water flows, those can have a very big influence, to Andy's earlier point about the need to manage surface water and groundwater conjunctively. Land use changes also, Andy also touched on this, can influence the way that water runs off of the landscape, runs off of the watershed and into the river system, and that affects those water flow signatures. And now we're seeing also, of course, the effects of a shifting climate. Whether or not we may have the same volume of water generally moving through our river systems, even in those cases we see that water is coming perhaps in more frequent, intense bursts like we saw in Pensacola last night. Or we're seeing longer periods of drought in between normal flows. So in many places in the world, climate change is resulting in water volume overall, but in virtually all places, changes in the historical variability patterns of the water flow. And of course, unfortunately, these changes have brought some very unfortunate consequences for the species the other species that depend upon these river ecosystems, depend upon the water in these systems. Whether it's drying up rivers too much, as Andy touched on, changing the quality of the water, what have you. Sometimes just changing the timing of when high flow events or floods occur can completely disable the reproduction process in a lot of species that are very closely tied to having floods during a particular time of the year to really be able to synchronize with their life cycles. So all of these effects have had some pretty heavy impacts on plants and animals within and alongside river systems. And in fact, dams and diversions are now recognized by most scientists around the world as being the leading cause of the very serious declines that we've witnessed in freshwater ecosystems. And so it's something that we need to pay attention to. And of course, then the challenge is, how do we manage water so that we can meet the real needs of the human population, but do that in a way that also enables the other plants and animals on the planet to be able to persist, if not to thrive as well. And so in the science community, we have been talking for decades now about how do you figure out how much water you need to leave in the system, how much variability needs to be retained, what kind of a semblance of the original historical patterns of flow variation are necessary to sustain healthy ecological conditions. And so over time, its own field of science has really developed around this, what we call environmental flow science. And the challenge here is really to make those judgment calls on the basis of data that's been collected, observations of how species respond to different alterations or changes in water flow regimes. And so our challenge is to figure out what kind of flow or fluctuations in rivers, lakes, and aquifers sustain those healthy ecosystems and the many goods and services that people derive from them, whether it's the aesthetics of having, beautiful plant life and animal life alongside rivers and within rivers, recreational benefits, things like commercial fisheries, recreational fisheries, and those sorts of things. Those are all things, of course, that benefit the human population. And what we're striving for here, of course, is that optimal balance, the optimal situation where we can have as much of all of it as possible. And so, again, teams of scientists have been working on trying to answer those questions for rivers all over the world. This is one of my favorite illustrations from some work that a lot of us were involved with on the Savannah River down in the southeastern United States, on the Savannah River that runs between Georgia and South Carolina. It's just a pictorial representation of some of those relationships between water flow fluctuations and what bird life is doing, what plants, riparian vegetation, bottomland hardwood forests are doing, what are the fish, in the river doing. And all of these things are intimately keyed. The flow is really, again, the conductor of the orchestra, of the ecological orchestra here. And so it's really a challenge for scientists to be able to figure out how much of that natural variability can you alter and not disable a lot of those ecological functions and a lot of that health in the ecosystem. And so this is what a scientific prescription can look like. There's many different ways to express, but you can see it's getting very particular. How much water, during what time of the year, or maybe between dry years and average years and wet years, and what are the specific ecological benefits that might derive from providing water flows, for providing those kinds of conditions. So again, this is just one way of expressing that and putting this all together to sort of make the case or to help people understand what could be lost if you don't provide those conditions adequately. And so, let's see, getting a little bit more of a delay. And so again, back to the points about really dams and water diversions and pumping have had perhaps the most drastic impact on these water flow conditions. They have modified or altered the original patterns of water flow most greatly. These other effects are certainly can be quite intense and quite important, particularly in a localized area, or particularly in the smaller watersheds, the smaller rivers and streams. But dams and water diversions and pumping can have really massive effects. And so again, just to sort of revisit that a little bit, dams, because they block the flow of the water, impede the flow of water downstream, and then those flow patterns are dictated by the release of water, and the fact that so many dams have been built over time. This little animation just shows you only the largest dams. So these are what they call, this is a category called large dams. So these dams are 50 feet or higher only. These dots only represent about half of the large dams that have been built over time. And it doesn't include all the smaller dams that have been built. And so you can see that dam building has progressed very, very swiftly and covered much of the planet, at least in certain continents. In fact, during the last half of the 20th century, within the United States, on average, one large dam was completed every single day for the last 50 years of the last century. That rate is now doubled outside the United States in the developing regions of the world. So we're now completing 2 large dams on average every single day in other parts of the world. So you can imagine the impact that it's having on river systems. There are ways of addressing these impacts, and the Nature Conservancy and many other organizations have worked productively, collaboratively with a number of dam managers to try to release water flows that begin to mimic, or at least the natural variability patterns, or at least begin to meet some of those ecological prescriptions, similar to the ones that I just showed you. We've had a long-running, more than a decade-long relationship with the Army Corps of Engineers, for example, where we're working with them to modify the operations of more than 30 dams across the United States. But there's a long ways to go. Just the Corps itself manages more than 600 dams, and there are literally thousands of large dams across the United States, all of them having varying degrees of impacts on the water flow conditions. I want to now move to, an issue that I personally consider to be of greatest concern when we're talking about keeping rivers healthy, keeping rivers flowing, sustaining the ecological health and the benefits that society derives from rivers. This is a map of the degree to which rivers around the world have been depleted by human uses, where human uses are removing water and reducing the volume of flow. Just looking at it from sort of a gross volume standpoint here. And as you see, there are regions across the temperate zones and also down in some of the southern latitudes, and particularly in Australia, southern Africa, the southwest coast of Chile, where rivers have been pretty heavily used and pretty heavily depleted in their flows. And, you can, sometimes this depletion can be entire or complete. In the case of the Colorado River, the other Colorado River to the west of Texas. Here you can see the time trends since the early 1900s. As we built more and more storage reservoirs, more and more large canals on that river to divert more and more of the water out of and away from the Colorado River, the water flow is now completely dried up before the Colorado River reaches its delta at the Sea of Cortez in Mexico. And where there once was one of the largest wetland areas on the North American continent, now looks like this. It's a completely dried out, salt-caked, essentially an ecological wasteland by any measure. And so we've made trade-offs here where we have depleted the Colorado River completely for human endeavors and human purposes, human benefits, but we've lost a lot ecologically at the same time. I wanted to show you a couple of other ways of looking at this issue of water depletion, losing the volume of water flow over time. This is for the Brazos in Texas, of course, and what's represented here is each of these bars. This is just 2 typical years over, sometime within the last decade or two. I can't remember exactly which years these were, but as I say, they're typical for the recent decades. And each of the bars represents, the total length of the bar represents how much water would have entered into the Brazos River in each of those months, in each of those years. The black part of the bar is how much water gets consumed, gets depleted from the river. And the gray bar part of the bar is how much water remains. So what you see here is that from month to month and year to year, there are some months where there's plenty of water still left in the river. The amount consumed for human endeavors is comparatively small. But then there are some months, and certainly during certain years, like is the case presently in the Brazos, where the uses of water for human purposes is consuming virtually all of the available water. Very, very little of the water is left for other reasons, to sustain the health of the river or for other ecological services like recreation and things that really benefit human populations, particularly the communities that live along those rivers. Let's see, I'm trying to get this. I apologize, sometimes this cursor isn't really picking up the advancing, there it is, okay. So here's one other way of looking at this issue of depletion of the volume. So this graph, as you can see, is representing the percent depletion on the left-hand side there. From 0 to 100 over time, and this is based on the water availability models, the computer models that have been developed for Texas, upon which much of the water planning in Texas is based upon these models. And so this happens to be for the Colorado River at Matagorda Bay, so the lower end of the Colorado River. And what you see is that there are many years where the depletion of the natural inflows, the natural water available, is quite heavy. More than 80%, 90% is not unusual down in that part of the river system. So again, a very, very high level of depletion taking place. Here's some work that we in the Nature Conservancy have been putting together recently for each of the river basins in Texas. And this is another way of looking at the issue of water depletion. And so this shows you the percent of time during which the water flows are depleted by 80% or more in the Colorado and the lower part of the Brazos here. And so if you're in a red zone or an orange zone, then more than half of the time the water flows are being depleted by more than 80%. And much of this information will be publicly available within the 6 to 12 months. And so you'll be able to see this kind of information for all the different river basins in Texas shortly. One of the reasons that I and many folks have become very concerned about this issue of depletion is it's not just about protecting fish and frogs or cottonwood trees or willow vegetation. It's about the fact that it's putting our entire society, our entire economies, our security, our water security at considerable jeopardy when we're depleting so much water from a system. And this is very much to be thought of not as absolute percentages, but more as sort of a shaded bar, if you will, even though it's not represented as such here. But what we've seen is that at fairly low levels of depletion on average, you start to see ecological impacts. As that progresses up to about half of the water being depleted out of the system, you begin to see a lot of ecosystem impacts, no longer able to generate hydropower effectively, no longer enough water to cool power plants, many recreational benefits and tourism benefits being substantially harmed. As you progress on to higher levels of depletion, seeing very serious impacts taking place. And so again, putting local and even regional economies at substantial risk when you're getting to those high levels of depletion. And as I illustrated for you with some of those previous graphs, that's already taking place in a number of the river basins within Texas. Again, I'm having to play around to get this cursor to show me how to advance the slides. So now we jumped ahead one. So here are just some of the numbers. Texas, as you all know, 2011, about $12 billion was estimated to have been lost. U.S., it's estimated that 6 to 8 is lost every single year. Some regions getting hit much more heavily than that when we have a bad drought. China, on average, almost $40 billion being lost on an ongoing average basis. So very serious concerns. I wanted to close with just a couple of solutions similar to what Andy offered to all of you. These are excerpted from a book that I just finished writing. Will come out next month from Island Press. You can see the title there, but just a couple of highlights from the book that I'd like to share with you here. Okay. Two big solutions, as I said. 2 points I really want to emphasize. One is that we have to be really careful not to over-allocate the available water. And that means paying attention to how much water is going to be available when you end up in a severe drought like the one that Texans are experiencing right now, as well as during average conditions or times when we have wetter years, more water availability. So really being careful not to over-allocate. And of course that means allocating or regulating to some degree all waters, not just surface water, but also groundwater. And as most of you know, there is essentially no regulation on groundwater use in most areas of Texas and in most areas of the United States and most areas of the world is similar situation. Groundwater is for the most part not controlled, the use of that groundwater. But even within surface water, the point of my showing you the slides, the graphs from the Colorado, the lower Colorado River going into Matagorda, the Brazos River, is to make the point that when you get used to using a large volume of water on a regular basis, it's really hard to cut back on that use when you get into less than average water years. And what happens then is you drive into a wall of water availability. There isn't enough water for everybody, as evidenced by the fact that farmers are getting cut off in the lower Colorado River, as evidenced by the fact that large industries in the lower Brazos River are having to complain and even filing lawsuits because other water users upstream of them are using water that they perhaps may not be entitled to. So we really have to be careful not to allocate so much water that you keep running into these problems. And these problems, we're hitting them on a recurring basis, and they're getting more intense all the time, and they're happening in places where they haven't happened or haven't happened much previously. So this is a really big deal and something we have to be very, very careful about. this is really starting to be a little bit annoying again. I apologize. I can't get the cursor to show up on the screen here, so I don't know where to. There we go. So here, just a visual illustration of that. Taking the case of groundwater, we are using much more groundwater than is being naturally replenished in many aquifers across the United States and around the world. In some cases, that rate of overuse is quite high, many, many more times than the natural rate of replenishment. That's the cases you see over much of Texas, particularly western Texas, and the High Plains or Ogallala Aquifer, but it's true also in other aquifers within Texas. Also true out in the Central Valley of California, which is very much in the news these days, and getting worse all the time because groundwater not being regulated like surface water is in California. Now that the surface water supplies are in such short availability, they're pumping groundwater like crazy to try to meet those demands, those needs in the meantime. The other major point I want to make in closing is we really need to focus investment in trying to solve these problems. We need to be investing in the most cost-effective and sustainable measures. And in looking at this, just by looking strictly at the cost per unit of water, this again I highlighted and went into considerable detail in my book, really giving emphasis to the fact that water conservation or watershed management activities, maintaining the health of the watershed, the health of the landscape from a hydrologic standpoint, those are by far and away the most cost-effective ways to address the problem of water scarcity, of water shortages. Everything else gets a lot more expensive, 3 to 10 times on average more expensive than an investment in water conservation or watershed management. And so we really do need to put high emphasis on this and make sure that we're maximizing water conservation first before we go to some of these other solutions, and making sure that if we're investing in these other solutions that we have met a high level of accomplishment on water conservation first. So just to illustrate the potential here, there was a recent study done out in California that looked across the western United States, including Texas, and found that Australian cities, for example, use half as much water as cities in the western U.S. And maintaining essentially the same quality of life, the same lifestyles. But primarily the difference there is their outdoor landscaping. The difference is, less obvious presence of green lawns, more use of native vegetation, less irrigated landscape areas in commercial and business areas, et cetera, et cetera. And so that makes a lot of difference. And we could save half of the water in our urban areas in the western U.S. just by following the example that Australia is taking. The other area I really want to emphasize is that there is tremendous potential in agriculture. There are places where those investments have already been made in improved irrigation efficiency, but in most water basins in the world, a relatively modest savings, perhaps on the order of 10, 15, 20%, would really free up a tremendous volume of water to be repurposed, whether it's allowing more water to be left in the rivers or providing urban water supply, industrial water supply. We really need to take a hard look at this, but to also do that in a way that's not competitive with the agricultural sector, but instead done collaboratively, done in a way that's voluntary, and finding ways to incentivize that as best we can. I'll close. I believe this is my last slide. This is just an illustration of the point that the water use efficiency, what we call gallons per capita per day in residential use in Texas, varies greatly from city to city. This is just one map. This is the Colorado River Basin, but we have maps, similar maps for all the other river basins in Texas, where the amount of water being used domestically varies greatly from city to city on average. And so for a lot of the cities, there is tremendous potential to do a lot better, to be a lot more conservative with the urban water uses. And again, particularly the amount of water that we're using outdoors and irrigating our landscaping is the first place to be looking for improved water savings. Those of you that are interested in more, here's a couple of websites. And thank you, Jennifer, for the invitation. I hope I haven't overrun my time by too far.
No, Brian, you kept time well, and thank you. You packed a lot of information into that, and we appreciate it.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for staying with us, and thanks for being on the webinar. I want to talk just a little bit about some options we have here in Texas for things that we might do to address some of these situations that you've just been polled about. The first thing I want to do is provide a little context for the situation that we find ourselves in right now with our water rights regulatory system. And some of you I know are already familiar with all of this, but I want to provide some background for everyone. This graphic is just sort of illustrating the cumulative water rights that we've issued over time in Texas. And in Texas, our surface water is owned in common by all of us, by all the people of the state of Texas. But we issue permits for people to use those water rights. And those are perpetual water right permits that are issued. They're basically based on first in time, first in right. So the oldest water rights have the first claim on the water. And it probably doesn't surprise you to know that environmental flow issues weren't real big back in the late 1800s or early 1900s when it came time to issue water rights. So we've issued all these water rights, and really up until about 1985, when we first started really routinely including environmental flow conditions in permits. What that means is that we've issued about well over 20 million acre-feet of water rights that basically don't have environmental flow protections in them. And those are the water rights that have the first claim on the water in times of shortage. And that makes a real challenge. It makes a really challenging situation for us in terms of meeting environmental flow needs. So what can we do about that? You know, one option might be regulatory approaches. What could we do there? What about more comprehensive conditions on new water right permits? Right now, we basically issue permits that try to limit the amount of additional harm or additional reduction in environmental flow that comes from the new permit. But if we're already starting from a situation where we have an existing problem, can we do more? Could we try to make those conditions more protective, where we say, yes, you can take water out during periods of high flow, but you have to actually put some of that water back during periods of low flow to help address some of the problems that we already have. We could consider adjudicating existing water rights. We did that once. Water rights that aren't fully used or maybe aren't being put to what's called beneficial use, aren't being used efficiently enough, potentially could be adjudicated and reduced in size to limit reductions. We could potentially have partial dedications on new transactions in water. So water rights can actually be sold, but they have to be, the transfer has to be approved by the state. What if we put conditions on that and said, yes, you can sell a water right, but you can only transfer a portion of it, and some of the water has to be dedicated back to the state to help meet environmental flows. And there are endangered species protections that Andy alluded to. A lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the whooping crane lawsuit in the Guadalupe Basin. Well, the reality is that those sort of regulatory approaches are going to be highly controversial, some more than others. Maybe we can pursue some of those over time, but some of them likely are not going to fly. Are there other things we can do? Are there some voluntary approaches that we could use to begin to address this situation? I want to talk a little bit about that. So one of those would be, well, what if we just went out and purchased some of those existing water rights that are for consumptive uses and then converted them to environmental flow protection purposes? That could certainly help the situation. Our variation on that theme would be a dry year option where you pay somebody, particularly maybe an irrigator that has a surface water right, that during dry years they wouldn't divert so that that flow could remain in the river. That's a variation on a transaction. That's something like similar to that is being done in the Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan to help maintain spring flows at Comal and San Marcos. Voluntary dedications of a portion of return flows. For a lot of our municipalities and various uses, water that's diverted and used indoors is treated and then gets discharged back into the stream. And for a number of our reaches in the state, that's the primary flow that's there during drought periods. But there's no guarantee that will continue to be true. There's a lot of interest in starting to use more of those return flows as a water supply. But one option is to dedicate at least a portion of those return flows for environmental purposes. The City of Houston reached an agreement with a number of conservation organizations recently that basically provides that half of the return flows to the City of Houston will remain as Galveston Bay inflows. How about helping to fund water conservation with some or all of the conserved water being dedicated for environmental flow protection? This would be a situation where perhaps irrigators can't afford the infrastructure to put in the highly efficient irrigation equipment, but if there was state funding to help with that, then we could put that water to better use, and the quid pro quo would be we're going to use that saved water for the environment. Brian alluded to remanaging dams a little bit. What can we do there to change the way dams are managed, maybe to pass more water through the dams and compensating for the loss in yield and water supply? Support improved land stewardship. If we could incentivize landowners in their management of their property, that benefits water quality, it benefits water quantity, affecting runoff, recharge, all of those values. A lot of landowners are doing a great job on this on their own, but the downstream folks are benefiting from that. So is there a way that we could compensate them? We could provide incentives for them to do more, or help people who can't afford to do it now to do a better job on that in a way that would benefit our streams and environmental flows. So all of these are going to cost money. That's one of the difficulties with the voluntary approaches. And we don't have time today to talk a whole lot about that, but we will in some of the future seminars talk about some options. One of the things that gives me hope is this poll that was taken early last year by the Bush School at Texas A&M, when they asked people about their importance of water use asked Texans about the importance of water use for various purposes. And one of those was water for the natural environment, which came in very well. People see the value of water for our environment and care about protecting that, and that's encouraging. One little side note on this, I was interested in looking at the top category, water for drinking, which out of a possible 10 only got a 9.1. And I was thinking, you know, who is it that doesn't vote water for drinking is important? And then I thought, oh yeah, beer. For some people, beer is for drinking, water is for bathing. Well, look, we know what can happen if we don't take action to protect our environmental flows. This picture is the mouth of the Rio Grande in the 2001-2002 period when, because of drought and high water use, flows in the river got so low that it actually stopped flowing to the Gulf of Mexico. There wasn't enough force to move the sand out of the way, and the river got disconnected from the Gulf of Mexico. And that's not a picture that I want to see repeated for that river or any others in the state. We need to do better than that. We really have the potential to pass on a rich natural heritage to future generations in Texans. We inherited that from past generations. Our management of our rivers, our streams, our water is one of the primary factors in determining what we pass on for our kids and our grandkids. This is a really important issue for the future of Texas. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
All right, Myron, thank you very much. We've got Jennifer Ellis has been monitoring the questions as they've come in, and she's going to go ahead and put some of those out to our speakers. We've got Brian and Myron and Andy still online, and so we'll be addressing some of the questions that you all have had during the presentation. So first
Okay, our first question I'm going to direct to you, Brian, and then the other speakers can also, of course, chime in. So the question is, why is the projected growth simply accepted as manifest destiny? Why isn't it understood to simply be a projection of recent trends? Can we expect to have an ever-expanding economic growth on a finite planet?
Yeah, terrific question, and a real difficult one to answer, of course. But you know, what's been really interesting to me is this point I made about the cost of different options for meeting your water supply, whether that's through water conservation all the way up to water desalinating, taking the salt out of either ocean water or out of salty groundwater, what's called brackish groundwater. And what's clearly happening over time is that communities, local governments are first exhausting, this is very logical of course, first exhausting the locally available water supplies, the easy water to get to, the cheap water to get to, but skipping over, the cheapest water supply in many cases, which is water conservation. But then having to move to more and more expensive options, having to bring in water from greater and greater distances in pipelines and canals, having to take the salt out of it, which is still the most expensive option available. And so I think the question is, I don't know that we're going to see the point in the coming decades where growth is actually going to hit a wall with water supply. Instead, I think what the more realistic projection is that we're going to see the cost of our water going up very, very steeply. Perhaps to the point that it's going to begin to really make a big difference in the household budgets, particularly for the poorer sectors of our society. There are some great examples of this, by the way. I'll just tell you one, which is the city of Adelaide in Australia. After exhausting their available local water supplies, importing water from some distance out of the Murray River, they finally went to desalination. And the cost of the desalination plant was so high that they estimate that about 20% of the households in the city can no longer comfortably afford it. In other words, it's like putting food on the table. They're actually having trouble paying their water bill. So I think that's going to be the interesting thing in the near-term future. But I do take your point about the philosophy is why do we always plan for unbounded, unlimited growth without consideration for what we're losing or even the impact that we're having on a resource like water supplies and healthy rivers and lakes and aquifers.
I think one reason why you see that ambitious projections in our Texas water plan is because if you don't get your water project in the plan, it's not acceptable for loans from the state or low interest financing. And so what you see is that everything that anybody has any idea they would ever want to build gets thrown in there is simply because, and even the authors of the plan will tell you that a considerable number of those projects will never be built, but we have a system where the incentive is to throw everything in there just simply because you don't want to be left out. So that results in a much more ambitious projection of growth than is actually the case.
Okay, thanks very much. The next question is I'm going to direct to Myron, and it's how does the drought help or hurt the ability to get positive momentum in implementing strategies to keep our rivers flowing?
How many minutes do I have? Yeah, so the drought's definitely a mixed blessing, if you will. It's hard on all of us, no question about it. It's hard on our natural environment. But it does tend to raise awareness of water use, makes people more conscious of how we use water. That can be a positive. We can gain from that and sort of recognize, look, we can get by with less water. We can start managing our water more efficiently all the time. On the other hand, it makes people really nervous about water supply, and that makes it more difficult to talk about environmental needs because, frankly, we've started to think of those as almost an extra, as not an essential in our water use. And I think that's a really flawed way of looking at the issue. It's kind of important to recognize that the environment was the first user of the water, and all that water was environmental flow at one point. And nature's resilient. nature can respond to reduced water use, but there are limits, and we're really pushing the point where maybe we push it over the edge. So I'm going to stop because I know we're running out of time.
So this is Jennifer Walker here, and we had some technical difficulties during this presentation, which put us behind a little bit. We're going to take an extra 5 minutes to answer questions, and I understand if some people need to jump off the line. If you do, there's information on this concluding slide here. We're going to have 2 more webinars coming up. One is going to focus on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and another one's going to focus on some programs being implemented by Trout Unlimited in the western United States that we think hold some promise here. And we will be posting a recording and video of this webinar online, as well as other information. So thank you for joining us. If you have to jump off, on behalf of National Wildlife Federation and Sierra Club and the Meta Center for Water and the Environment, we're really pleased that you all could join us today. And we're going to take time to answer just a few more questions here. So I just want to let people that have to get offline know.
Okay, I'll direct the next question to Brian. And the question asked was, dams are a commonly debated issue. How do we determine if a given dam is beneficial or detrimental to ecology?
Well, I think it, these are value-laden terms. Let me start there because that's why I'm going to be a little bit cagey in answering the question. It depends upon what you want from your rivers and streams. If what you want is to see the plants and animals that have historically lived in the river system, then it's hard for me to imagine an example, a case where the construction of a dam has not had, it hasn't caused change. And what I mean by change is a loss of species, a decline in the historic species populations, and those kinds of changes. So if your baseline is historical conditions and wanting to keep those as much the same as possible, then when you build a dam and you interrupt a river and basically sever it into pieces, you should expect that there's going to be some adverse consequences associated with that. So the question is really about mitigation and minimization of those kinds of impacts. And there are basically a couple of different ways that we approach trying to do that. One is don't build dams in the worst places. This is very true in the developing regions of the world where a lot of dams are being built in places that are greatly harming very poor populations that are dependent upon river ecosystems for their daily lives. But it's also true in the United States. We don't want to be building new dams in places that are highly valued for other purposes, if we can avoid them. Then the other option, of course, is if you are going to build it, or I should say whenever you build it, try to design it and operate it in a way that, that minimizes the ecological impacts. And there's a lot of different ways of doing that. Some degree of fish passage upstream and downstream, for example, but operating the dam so that you have somewhat natural patterns of water flow variability coming out of the dam. You're maintaining natural-like water temperatures coming out in the water coming out of the dam and those sorts of things. So those are the keys. Don't build them in the wrong places and then operate them as best you can.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brian. And then I'm going to have the last question go to Myron. The question is, the statement is that there are many lessons to be learned from the Edwards Aquifer Recovery Implementation Program. Are there any that are applicable to how we move forward with strategies to keep rivers flowing?
That's a great question. I'm assuming people generally know what the Edwards Aquifer Recovery Implementation Program now the Habitat Conservation Plan is, but it's related to protecting those spring flows at Comal and San Marcos Springs. And one of the big factors, a number of things we looked at, but one of the big factors is pumping from the Edwards Aquifer that can deplete those spring flows during drought conditions like the one we're having this year. It's going to be an interesting year for the Edwards. A couple of lessons, I think, are important things. I talked about voluntary measures and the idea that there's going to be a cost associated with that. How are we going to pay for those? that's a big part of what happened in the habitat conservation plan for the Edwards, is that we came up with, there's a funding mechanism where people pumping water from the Edwards are paying additional fees and using that money to help reduce pumping elsewhere, to cut back on pumping, pay for dry year options, pay for conservation plan, put more water into aquifer storage and recovery, so that maybe you're taking it out during high periods and using that water during drier periods. Those are the sorts of things we can do very similar measures on our rivers to protect flows there. So I think there are good lessons to be learned from that, as looking at the sort of examples that we can use, the sort of approaches, the sort of funding mechanisms that we ought to be looking at as we move forward trying to do a better job of managing our rivers.
All right. Well, thank you, Myron. And thanks to Brian and Andy for participating in the webinar today. And thank you very much to all of you for joining us. Thanks for bearing with our technical issues. We're learning this software, but we'll have it all ironed out for our second and third webinars, which we hope y'all can join us for. Once this webinar concludes, in just a minute here, you're going to have a survey or evaluation form pop up on your screen. We hope that you'll answer the questions there to help us improve future webinars. And thank you for attending today.